They laughed when he adopted 5 blind dogs, mocking his decision and calling it hopeless. But what they didn't see was the quiet determination of a man who believed in second chances. Years later, those same people couldn't hide their envy as his life transformed in ways no one could have imagined. What made them jealous? And how did these blind dogs help him build a life so extraordinary that even his harshest critics had to take notice? Stay with us for this heartwarming story of resilience, redemption, and the power of love to change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rescue center's yard as Daniel Reyes grabbed his cleaning supplies. The crisp air nipped at his fingers while he checked his clipboard, the sound of stirring animals filling the peaceful morning. Birds chirped their morning songs from nearby trees, and the rustling of leaves added to nature's gentle symphony. "Morning, Mateo," Daniel called out as his young intern hurried through the gate, nearly dropping his water bottle in his eagerness. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from his rush. "Sorry I'm late." Mateo adjusted his navy blue uniform, tugging at the wrinkled collar. Traffic was crazy on Oak Street. There was construction everywhere. Daniel smiled warmly, noting the genuine concern in the young man's eyes. "You're right on time. Let's start with the small enclosures and work our way up. We got quite a few hungry mouths to feed this morning." They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side. Daniel demonstrated proper cleaning techniques while Mateo followed along, his enthusiasm making up for his inexperience. The morning dew dampened their shoes as they moved between enclosures. "So what's on the schedule today?" Mateo asked, scrubbing a cage with careful attention. His forehead creased in concentration. "Regular feeding rounds, health checks on the recovering raccoons, and—" Daniel paused, glancing toward the larger enclosures, worry creeping into his expression. "We need to keep a close eye on Ember." They moved toward the bobcat's enclosure, their steps slowing as they spotted her. Ember paced back and forth, her pregnant belly swaying with each step. Her tawny fur caught the morning light, but her movements were anything but peaceful. Her tail twitched anxiously as she moved. "She should have had her kittens by now, right?" Mateo whispered, keeping his voice low to avoid startling her. His hands gripped the railing tightly. Daniel nodded, pulling out his notebook, his pen hovering over the page. "She's overdue. I need to let Dr. Moreno know. This isn't something we can ignore." Inside the clinic, Dr. Alyssa Moreno frowned at Ember's file, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she studied the papers. "Her blood work looks normal, but this delay concerns me. We can't take any chances." Naomi Fields leaned against the examination table, her experienced eyes scanning the medical charts. Her fingers drummed thoughtfully against the metal surface. "It's not just physical, Alyssa. That roadside zoo did a number on her. Wild animals carry trauma differently than domestic ones." "How so?" Dr. Moreno asked, looking up from the file, genuine curiosity in her expression. "Stress can completely throw off their natural instincts," Naomi explained, crossing her arms. "Ember spent years in a cage barely bigger than this exam room. She never had the chance to learn proper nesting behaviors. The poor thing was basically a prisoner." At the viewing platform, Daniel approached Ember's enclosure with slow, measured steps. The gravel crunched softly under his boots as he moved closer, keeping his voice gentle and steady. Morning mist still clung to the air around them. "Hey there, beautiful girl," he murmured, his tone soft and reassuring. Ember's response was immediate. A deep growl rumbled from her throat as she retreated to the furthest corner, her ears flattened against her head. Her amber eyes never left Daniel's face, watching his every move. Behind Daniel, Mateo shifted nervously, his shoes scuffing against the ground. "What if she never trusts us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with concern. Daniel turned to his intern, trying to offer reassurance despite the flicker of uncertainty he felt. His eyes softened with understanding. Trust takes time, especially with wild animals. We have to be patient. The morning sun climbed higher as they watched Ember continue her restless pacing, her unease evident in every step she took. The shadows grew shorter as time ticked by, marking another uncertain day in their ongoing challenge. The fluorescent lights hummed in the meeting room as Dr. Moreno spread Ember's medical charts across the table. Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on the worn wooden surface, while Naomi stood near the window, her arms crossed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the blinds, highlighting the tension in the room. "We need to do an ultrasound," Dr. Moreno said firmly, tapping her pen against the charts. "She's overdue, and we can't risk complications. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes." Naomi shook her head, her expression tight with concern. Sedating her now could push her stress levels through the roof. Wildcats are incredibly sensitive during pregnancy. We've already put her through so much with the rescue. Daniel rubbed his temple, looking between his two colleagues. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. "What's the minimum dose we'd need?" he asked Dr. Moreno, hoping to find middle ground. "Just enough to keep her calm for 10 minutes, Dr. Moreno replied, pointing to some numbers on the chart. "We've used this protocol before. It's proven safe." "On cats that weren't already traumatized," Naomi countered, moving away from the window. "She's barely settling in as it is. One wrong move could set back all our progress." In the storage shed, Daniel and Mateo sorted through supplies, loading soft blankets and monitoring equipment into a plastic bin. The musty air filled their lungs as they worked in tense silence. Mateo's hands trembled slightly as he folded a thick padding mat, his worry evident in every movement. "Daniel!" Mateo's voice was barely above a whisper, cracking with emotion. "What if we make things worse?" Daniel paused, a roll of gauze in his hand. "I'm scared too," he admitted, placing a gentle hand on Mateo's shoulder and giving it a reassuring squeeze. "But sometimes we have to take calculated risks to help them. That's part of what we do." At the enclosure's edge, the team moved with practiced precision, though anxiety radiated from each of them. Naomi positioned herself to block Ember's escape route, while Dr. Moreno readied the dart gun, her movements deliberately slow and steady. Daniel and Mateo waited nearby with the equipment, their hearts pounding in their chests. Ember's eyes locked onto them, her muscles tensing beneath her spotted coat. The dart found its mark, and she let out a fierce snarl that made Mateo flinch and step backward. She thrashed against the sedative, her movements becoming increasingly sluggish, paws scrabbling against the ground. "Easy, girl," Daniel murmured, though he knew his words meant nothing to her. His own guilt gnawed at him as he watched her fight the medication. Dr. Moreno gripped her stethoscope, watching intently as Ember's eyelids grew heavy. "It's done," she whispered, but her furrowed brow betrayed her uncertainty. Naomi stood rigid, her disapproval evident in her stance as they prepared to transfer Ember to the clinic, the gravity of their decision weighing heavily on them all. The harsh clinic lights cast stark shadows as Daniel and Mateo helped position Ember on the padded examination table. Her sedated form looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, like a house cat rather than the fierce predator she truly was. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the protective padding beneath her head, memories of past failures threatening to surface. Dr. Moreno squeezed the ultrasound gel onto Ember's belly, her movements precise and gentle, as if handling delicate crystal. "Keep her steady," she whispered, pressing the probe against the bobcat's fur. The room fell silent, except for the soft whirring of medical equipment and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Mateo shifted from foot to foot, his sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his scrub top, betraying his nervousness. Daniel placed a steadying hand on the young intern's shoulder, though his own heart raced with worry for both Ember and his protege. The grainy black and white image flickered to life on the monitor, casting an ethereal glow across their faces. Dr. Moreno's brow furrowed as she moved the probe, her expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she worked. Suddenly, she inhaled sharply. "This can't be right." "What is it?" Daniel leaned closer, squinting at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. "There are more kittens than we thought," Dr. Moreno explained, her finger tracing shapes on the monitor like a teacher pointing out constellations. "And this one here." She paused, her voice tightening with professional concern. "It's positioned dangerously close to her pelvic bone." Naomi stepped away from her post at the door, moving closer to examine the screen, her clipboard forgotten in her hands. "What does that mean for Ember? If she doesn't go into labor soon, we might need surgical intervention." Dr. Moreno's words hung heavy in the air like storm clouds. The positioning could cause serious complications during natural birth. We need to monitor her closely. Outside the clinic window, afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground that danced with each breeze. Mateo stood alone, his young face pressed against the glass, as he listened to Dr. Moreno and Naomi discussing the risks in hushed tones, their words becoming a blur of medical terminology he barely understood. Unable to bear it any longer, he rushed to find Daniel, who was organizing supplies nearby with methodical precision. Tears spilled down Mateo's cheeks as he grabbed his mentor's arm, his composure finally breaking. "What if we lose her?" His voice cracked, raw with emotion. "Or the kittens?" Back inside, Dr. Moreno remained fixed at the ultrasound monitor, her expression grim as she took more measurements. The image of the precariously positioned kitten glowed on the screen like a warning beacon as she spoke softly. "We have to prepare for the worst." On the examination table, Ember lay still, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, unaware of the concern that filled the room around her. Her whiskers twitched occasionally in her sedated sleep, a reminder of the wild spirit that lay dormant within her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Dr. Moreno stood before her team, her face etched with concern. She pointed to the ultrasound images displayed on the screen behind her, the black and white shapes flickering under the harsh fluorescent lights. "These images show something rare," she explained, tracing the outline with her finger, her hand steady despite her worry. "We might be looking at twins sharing one sac, or worse, abnormal positioning that could complicate delivery. Either scenario poses significant risk." Naomi stepped forward, her shoulders tense, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Surgery should be our absolute last resort," she insisted, her voice firm but controlled. "Wild animals have been giving birth successfully for thousands of years without our intervention. We need to trust their instincts." Daniel nodded, finding himself agreeing with Naomi, his own experiences with wildlife rehabilitation weighing heavily on his mind. "Maybe we should give her more time," he suggested, running a hand through his hair. "Ember's already been through so much trauma. Adding surgery to that might be too much for her." In the hallway outside the treatment room, Naomi paced as she continued her argument, her footsteps echoing against the tile floor. "I've seen this in the field," she said, stopping to face Dr. Moreno, her eyes bright with conviction. "When we rush in thinking we know better than nature, we often do more harm than good. These animals are stronger than we give them credit for. And I've seen mothers and babies die because we waited too long," Dr. Moreno countered, her usually calm demeanor showing cracks of frustration as she crossed her arms. We can't ignore the risks here, not when we have the means to help. Later that night, Daniel sat alone in his small dorm-style room, the moonlight casting a silver glow across his desk. He held an old photograph, its edges worn from handling, the glossy surface dulled by years of touch. In it, a younger version of himself cradled a red-tailed hawk, its wing wrapped in bandages, its fierce eyes still bright with life. The memory of that day still burned, like a wound that refused to heal. Despite his best efforts, the hawk hadn't survived. He'd been too hesitant, too afraid to make the wrong choice, and in the end, his indecision had cost the bird its life. The weight of that failure still pressed against his chest. "I should have done more," he whispered to the photograph, his throat tight with emotion. Setting down the picture, he walked to his window and looked out at the moonlit grounds of the rescue center, where shadows danced beneath the swaying trees. "Not this time," he said softly, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "I won't fail her. I can't." In her enclosure, Ember paced restlessly under the pale moonlight, her swollen belly a testament to the precious lives she carried. Her tail twitched with nervous energy as she moved back and forth, following some ancient instinct that humans could only guess at. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Daniel and Mateo approached Ember's enclosure, their arms full of fresh straw and soft blankets. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the sky in gentle pinks and oranges, casting long shadows across the rescue center grounds. "Easy does it," Daniel whispered, carefully setting down the supplies. "Let's make it inviting for her. Remember what we talked about. Slow and steady movements." Mateo nodded, following Daniel's lead as they quietly arranged the bedding materials. They worked with careful movements, trying not to startle Ember, who watched them with wary eyes from her corner, her tail twitching nervously with each rustle of straw. When they finished, Daniel stepped back, hoping to see Ember investigate their offering. Instead, she padded over and with one swift motion of her paw, pushed the fresh straw aside. The blankets met the same fate, scattered across the enclosure floor like discarded autumn leaves. "She's not having any of it," Mateo murmured, his shoulders slumping. His voice carried the weight of disappointment that had become all too familiar lately. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exchanging a worried look with his young intern. The morning light caught the concern etched across his features. Before he could respond, Naomi appeared at his side, her footsteps soft on the dewy grass. "Daniel, walk with me?" she asked softly, gesturing toward the forest edge. Her expression held a hint of understanding that made him curious. As they walked, the morning air crisp around them, Naomi suddenly stopped. She pointed to a clearing ahead where a doe and her fawn emerged from the underbrush. The mother deer moved with grace, her young one following close behind, their hooves barely making a sound on the forest floor. "Watch them," Naomi whispered. "See how the mother leads her baby? No interference, no pressure, just natural instinct at work." She turned to Daniel, her eyes serious but kind. Wild mothers need space and security to follow their instincts. Every time we go in there trying to help, we might actually be making Ember more anxious. Sometimes the best care comes from taking a step back. Daniel watched the deer pair disappear into the trees, letting Naomi's words sink in. The parallel was clear. Their constant presence and intervention might be doing more harm than good. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine needles and possibility. Meanwhile, inside the rescue center, Dr. Moreno paced the hallway, phone pressed to her ear. Her footsteps echoed against the tile floor as she walked. "Yes, I understand," she said to her colleague on the line. "So you've seen similar cases. where too much human interaction delayed labor? That matches what we're seeing here. She listened intently, her free hand fidgeting with her pen, making small circles on her notepad. The conversation seemed to confirm what Naomi had been saying all along. Sometimes helping meant stepping back, letting nature take its course. As the morning wore on, Daniel found himself standing outside Ember's enclosure again. He watched her pace, her movements betraying her restlessness, her swollen belly a reminder of the precious life she carried. Naomi's words echoed in his mind. Wild mothers need space and security. The truth of those words seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Taking a deep breath, he stepped back from the enclosure. Though uncertain weighed heavy in his chest like an anchor, he knew giving Ember space might be their best chance at helping her. Sometimes the hardest part of caring was knowing when to let go. In the storage area behind the rescue center, Mateo wiped sweat from his forehead as he sorted through old equipment, the musty air making his nose twitch. A dusty box caught his attention, its corners worn from years of storage. And as he lifted the lid, a photograph fluttered to the floor like an autumn leaf. He picked it up, squinting at the image of a younger Daniel with a magnificent red-tailed hawk perched on his arm, their shared confidence evident in the snapshot. "I didn't know you worked with birds," Mateo said when Daniel walked in, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. Daniel's face fell as he saw the photo, the light dimming in his eyes. He took it gently, running his thumb over the faded edge as if touching a precious memory. "That was Raja," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "My biggest regret." "What happened?" Daniel leaned against the wall, his eyes distant and clouded with old pain. "She came in with a broken wing. Simple enough, we thought. But I rushed things, made bad calls. When complications came up, I panicked instead of staying calm." He swallowed hard, his shoulders tensing. "She didn't make it. I can still remember the moment we lost her." Mateo stood silent, watching his mentor's pain surface like waves on a shore. "Is that why you're so careful with Ember?" "Every animal deserves our best," Daniel nodded, straightening up slightly. "Sometimes being careful means knowing when to step back. It's a lesson I learned the hard way." In the admin office, Dr. Moreno spread Ember's file across her desk, the harsh fluorescent lights highlighting every disturbing detail. The photos from the roadside zoo showed bare cages and empty food bowls, a testament to neglect. Her fingers traced over the veterinary notes: malnutrition, stress, fear responses to human contact, each word telling a story of suffering. With a heavy sigh, she removed her stethoscope and placed it on the desk, the metal catching the light. "How do we help you trust us?" she whispered to Ember's intake photo, studying the fear in the cat's eyes. The rumble of Naomi's patrol truck cut through the afternoon quiet, tires crunching on gravel. She was making her usual rounds when her phone rang, the sharp tone splitting the peaceful atmosphere. The caller's words made her grip the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Poachers! How close?" She listened intently, her jaw clenching with each word. "No, you did right to call. I'll handle it." Pulling over near the forest boundary, Naomi made a quick call to the center's security team, her voice steady despite her concern. "We need to set up night patrols," she said firmly, scanning the tree line. "They've been spotted less than 5 miles from here." She glanced toward Ember's enclosure in the distance, barely visible through the trees. The last thing she needs is more stress from increased human activity in the area. We have to be smart about this. She ended the call and sat back in her seat, watching the tree line as shadows lengthened across the ground like dark fingers. Reaching for her flashlight, she checked its batteries with practiced efficiency. The forest was growing darker, branches swaying in the evening breeze, and she had a long night ahead of her. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders, like a familiar blanket. The evening air grew cool as Daniel carefully arranged the new den inside Ember's enclosure. He lined the sheltered space with soft bedding, sprinkling it with fish-scented attractant, making sure to create layers that would keep both mother and kittens warm. His movements were slow and deliberate, mindful of Naomi's wisdom about giving wild mothers space. Every detail mattered: the depth of the bedding, the width of the entrance, the sheltered positioning. "Just for you, girl," he whispered, stepping back from his work, fighting the urge to do more. The den sat nestled against the back wall, partially hidden by branches, a perfect spot for a nervous mother-to-be. He'd chosen the location carefully, making sure it offered protection from both weather and prying eyes. Up on the observation deck, Mateo pressed the binoculars against his eyes while Naomi stood beside him, her arms crossed. They watched as Ember emerged from behind a rock, her nose twitching at the new scents. Her pregnant belly swayed slightly as she moved, heavy with her precious cargo. "She's checking it out," Mateo said, his voice tight with hope. The bobcat took tentative steps toward the den, whiskers forward, ears swiveling to catch every sound. "Easy now," Naomi murmured. "Let her explore at her own pace." Her fingers drummed quietly against her arm, betraying her own nervousness. Ember crept closer, sniffing the entrance. For a moment, she poked her head inside, and Mateo's breath caught. But just as quickly, she backed away, tail twitching, her body language showing clear uncertainty. "Come on," Mateo groaned, lowering the binoculars. "Why won't she just use it?" The frustration in his voice masked a deeper worry about Ember's well-being. Naomi placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Nature can't be rushed, Mateo. We have to trust her instincts." She squeezed lightly, trying to transfer some calm to her anxious colleague. In the clinic office, Dr. Moreno sat at her desk, surrounded by medical charts and surgical tools. Her eyes were red-rimmed as she checked supplies for a C-section. "What's the right call?" she asked the empty room, her voice cracking. She wiped away a tear with the back of her hand, then began organizing instruments into sterile trays, each clink of metal against metal echoing in the quiet space. The moon cast long shadows across the enclosure as Daniel watched from his distant post. Ember paced around the den, occasionally pausing to sniff at it before moving on. Her restlessness seemed to echo the team's growing concerns. The night air carried the scent of pine and approaching rain. "Come on, Ember, you can do this," Daniel whispered into the darkness, his words carried away by the gentle night breeze. He crossed his arms against the chill, remembering all too well how it felt to watch and wait, hoping for the best, but fearing the worst. The night air carried a sharp chill as Naomi patrolled the perimeter of the rescue center, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the fence line and casting long shadows among the trees. A sudden rustling sound made her freeze mid-step. Years of field experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming danger. She pulled out her radio with steady hands. "Daniel, Mateo, I need you at the west fence. Now. Possible intruder." Within minutes, the soft crunch of hurried footsteps announced their arrival. Daniel's face was tight with concern as he joined her, his shoulders tense, while Mateo nervously shifted from foot to foot, his eyes darting around the darkness. "Look," Naomi whispered, pointing her light at the ground where the soil was still damp from earlier rain. Fresh boot prints marked the soft earth, leading away from the center, the treads clear and deep. "They're getting bolder. These couldn't be more than an hour old." Daniel's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "We need to secure Ember's enclosure. Tonight. No more waiting." Back inside the rescue center, Daniel and Mateo worked quietly, installing motion-sensitive lights around Ember's space. The tools felt cold in their hands as they worked in the night air. Mateo's hands trembled as he held the wiring, nearly dropping a connection. "What if the lights stress her more?" he asked, remembering Naomi's warnings about keeping Ember calm. "She's already so on edge with the kittens. I don't want to make things worse." Daniel paused his work, placing a steady hand on Mateo's shoulder and meeting his worried gaze. "I know you're worried. We all are. But right now, keeping her safe from poachers is our priority. We have to protect her. Sometimes that means making tough choices." A metallic clang echoed from somewhere in the darkness, making them all jump and spin around. Inside her enclosure, Ember's reaction was immediate and fierce. She dropped into a defensive crouch, her muscles coiled tight, a low growl rumbling from her throat. Her eyes reflected the dim security lights, wide with fear and maternal instinct. Daniel moved closer to the fence, keeping his voice soft and steady, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay, girl. We're here. Nobody's going to hurt you or your babies." He stayed perfectly still, one hand resting on the fence, hoping his calm presence might ease her fear despite the barrier between them. Her ears twitched at the sound of his familiar voice. The motion-sensitive light suddenly flashed on with brilliant intensity, casting harsh shadows across the yard and illuminating every tree and bush. A dark figure moved along the perimeter, quick and silent as a shadow. Naomi raised her flashlight, her other hand gripping her radio tightly as she prepared for another long night of vigilance. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained steady as she radioed for backup. From her enclosure, Ember's warning growl cut through the darkness, rising in volume and intensity, a mother's fierce protection rising above her fear. The sound echoed through the night, both a challenge and a promise to defend what was hers at any cost. The early morning sun hadn't yet risen when Dr. Moreno stood in the clinic, methodically arranging surgical tools on a sterile tray. Her hands shook slightly as she placed each instrument, the metal clinking softly against the stainless steel surface. "This isn't what I wanted," she whispered, stepping back from the table. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. She picked up a scalpel, then set it down again, her fingers trembling. At Ember's enclosure, Daniel watched intently as the bobcat's behavior shifted. She approached the den he'd prepared, her nose twitching with interest at the fresh materials. Encouraged by this small change, he pulled off the flannel shirt he'd worn for the past 2 days. Carefully, he dropped it near the edge of the enclosure. "Maybe my scent will help you trust us," he said softly, watching as Ember's whiskers quivered at the new addition to her space. Behind the rescue center, Mateo and Naomi sat on weathered wooden benches, brainstorming ways to help their anxious patient. "What about playing nature sounds?" Mateo suggested, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "You know, like forest noises? It might make her feel more at home." Naomi's face lit up. "That's actually brilliant, Mateo. Animals respond well to familiar environmental cues." She squeezed his shoulder proudly. "You're really starting to think like a wildlife specialist." Mateo blushed at the praise, ducking his head with a small smile. The team gathered outside the enclosure as Mateo carefully positioned a small weather-resistant speaker. He adjusted the volume until the gentle sounds of cricket chirps and rustling leaves filled the air. Daniel stood completely still, watching as Ember's ears swiveled toward the familiar forest sounds. "Look," he breathed, barely moving his lips as he spoke. Everyone remained motionless, hoping this small change might be the breakthrough they needed. The afternoon sun filtered through the control room's windows as Mateo adjusted the volume knobs with careful precision. His fingers moved deliberately across the panel, fine-tuning the hidden speakers that filled Ember's enclosure with gentle forest sounds. The soft chirping of birds and rustling leaves created a peaceful atmosphere. From her position on the observation deck, Naomi leaned forward, her keen eyes fixed on Ember. The bobcat's ears twitched at each new sound, her head turning slightly to track the familiar noises. "She's listening," Naomi said softly, a small smile warming her usually serious expression. At the enclosure viewing area, Daniel held his breath as Ember took tentative steps toward the den. Her movements were slower now, more deliberate. She lowered her head to sniff at the materials he'd laid out, her whiskers twitching as she caught his scent on the shirt he'd left. Her shoulders, usually tight with tension, had begun to relax. "It's working," Daniel whispered to Mateo, his voice thick with emotion. The young intern's face lit up with relief, his earlier anxiety melting away as they watched Ember's careful exploration. Through the clinic window, Dr. Moreno stood motionless, the surgery consent form clutched in her hands. She watched as Ember moved with increasing confidence around the den area. The sight made her pause, and she slowly lowered the form to her desk. For the first time since the ultrasound, a spark of hope flickered in her tired eyes. The natural sounds continued to play through the hidden speakers, creating a bubble of wilderness within the enclosure. Ember's response to this familiar environment was unmistakable. Her movements became more fluid, less guarded. She approached the den again, this time venturing closer to the entrance. Time seemed to slow as Ember took a tentative step into the den. The team held their collective breath. Though she stayed only for a moment before backing out, the significance of this small action wasn't lost on anyone. Daniel and Mateo exchanged glances, their eyes bright with hope. Around them, the recorded sounds of the forest continued to play. A gentle symphony of crickets, rustling leaves, and distant bird calls that seemed to wrap Ember in a cocoon of familiar comfort. The last rays of sunlight painted long shadows across the ground as Naomi walked her patrol route. Her boots crunched softly on the gravel path until she stopped abruptly, crouching to examine something in the dirt. Fresh footprints marked the earth near the forest boundary, their treaded pattern distinct and concerning. She grabbed her radio, her voice tight with urgency. "Daniel, Mateo, we've got fresh tracks out here. The poachers have been back." "Copy that," Daniel's voice crackled through the radio. "What's our next move?" "We need more security, but we can't risk spooking Ember," Naomi replied, studying the tracks. "She's finally showing progress." Later that evening, the fluorescent lights hummed softly in the cafeteria as Daniel and Mateo sat across from each other, picking at their dinner. The usual chatter of the day shift had faded, leaving them in contemplative silence. Mateo pushed his food around his plate, then looked up at Daniel with vulnerable eyes. "Can I tell you something?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded, setting down his fork to give Mateo his full attention. "It's about Ember," Mateo continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never really had... Well, my mom wasn't around much growing up. Watching Ember, seeing how strong she is, how she's fighting to protect her babies, it means something to me. More than I thought it would." Daniel reached across the table and squeezed Mateo's shoulder. "Your dedication to her shows. We're making progress, even if it's slow." Meanwhile, in the clinic storage room, Dr. Moreno sorted through various supplies when her hand brushed against a small vial. She held it up to the light, her eyes widening with recognition. The label indicated a rare herbal blend known for its calming effects on wild felines. "This could be it," she whispered, turning the vial in her hands. The amber liquid caught the light, and for the first time in days, hope flickered in her eyes. This natural solution might be exactly what they needed to help Ember without resorting to surgery. As darkness settled over the rescue center, Naomi worked efficiently to install additional motion sensors around the perimeter. Each device blinked to life as she tested them, creating an invisible barrier of protection. Inside, Daniel and Mateo carefully measured the herbal solution, their movements deliberate and synchronized. They worked in comfortable silence, their shared purpose evident in every careful preparation. "Ready?" Daniel asked softly, holding the prepared solution. Mateo nodded, his expression determined. "For Ember." The night air hung cool and still as Naomi carefully approached Ember's enclosure, a small bottle of herbal solution clutched in her hand. The only sounds were the gentle forest recordings playing through hidden speakers, crickets chirping, and leaves rustling in a phantom breeze. With practiced movements, she sprinkled several drops near the den's entrance. The earthy, calming scent merged seamlessly with the natural ambiance they'd created. From their concealed observation spot behind dense shrubs, Daniel and Mateo hardly dared to breathe as they watched. "Now we wait," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. Minutes ticked by slowly. Ember emerged from the shadows, her movements cautious but less tense than before. Her nose twitched as she caught the herbal scent. Daniel gripped Mateo's arm instinctively as they watched her approach the den. This time was different. Instead of quickly retreating, Ember stepped inside. Her powerful paws began working the bedding materials, pushing and pulling them into new arrangements. Daniel's eyes welled with tears as he watched this first real sign of nesting behavior. "She's doing it," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Beside him, Mateo wiped his own eyes with the back of his hand. In the clinic hall, Dr. Moreno stood transfixed before the security monitor. Her hands pressed against her chest as she watched Ember's transformation. "Thank you," she whispered, a prayer of gratitude escaping her lips. The weight of worry that had burdened her began to lift. The bobcat moved with deliberate care, arranging and rearranging the soft materials until they met her standards. Finally, Ember lowered herself into the den, her movements slow and purposeful. She settled onto the bedding, her eyes half closed in what appeared to be contentment. Daniel turned to Mateo, their faces illuminated by the soft security lights. No words were needed. Their shared smile said everything. They had finally earned Ember's trust. The first hints of sunrise painted the sky in soft pinks and purples as Daniel and Mateo maintained their quiet vigil near Ember's enclosure. Inside her den, the bobcat's behavior had shifted dramatically. She paced in tight circles, occasionally pausing to release low, rumbling sounds, unlike anything they'd heard from her before. "This is it," Daniel breathed, barely audible. His hands trembled slightly as he watched Ember through his binoculars. Beside him, Mateo shifted nervously, his eyes wide with anticipation. The peaceful morning shattered when Naomi's voice crackled over the radio. "Movement in the trees! Multiple flashlights heading toward the south fence." Her urgent whisper made Daniel's heart race. Through the dim light, he could make out the bobbing beams of light through the forest. Naomi's footsteps crunched through the underbrush as she moved to intercept the intruders. "This is private property," she shouted, her voice piercing the dawn quiet. "Security has been notified." The flashlights wavered, then scattered in different directions. Daniel held his breath, watching Ember anxiously. The bobcat's ears twitched at the commotion, and she let out a low growl. In the clinic's radio room, Dr. Moreno gripped her desk as she listened to the unfolding situation. Her fingers flew across her phone's keypad, dialing Daniel's number. "Whatever you do, keep absolutely silent," she instructed when he answered. "Any disturbance now could stop her labor. We can't risk it." Her voice carried the weight of professional concern and personal investment. Daniel ended the call and signaled to Mateo to remain completely still. They watched as Ember lowered herself to the ground, her body visibly tensing with what appeared to be contractions. The sun crept higher, casting golden light across the enclosure. while Daniel whispered words of encouragement so softly they were barely more than thoughts. "You've got this, girl. You're safe now. We're here." The mid-morning sun filtered through the trees as Daniel sat cross-legged on the ground, maintaining his vigil near Ember's enclosure. Her contractions had grown stronger, causing her to pause and tense every few minutes. Daniel began to hum softly, a gentle, steady tune he'd been using during his daily visits. Ember's ears twitched at the familiar sound, though her focus remained inward as another contraction gripped her. At the perimeter fence, Naomi's flashlight beam cut through the shadows. "Stop right there," she commanded, her voice carrying authority despite its controlled volume. "Wildlife authorities are on speed dial. You have exactly 30 seconds to clear out before I make the call." The rustling in the undergrowth intensified as multiple figures scrambled away. Their flashlight beams bounced erratically through the trees before disappearing entirely. Naomi's jaw clenched as she studied the fresh footprints left in the damp soil. She began a steady patrol around the perimeter, her eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of their return. Inside the clinic, Dr. Moreno's fingers drummed nervously on the desk as she watched the security feed. The emergency surgical kit lay ready beside her, though she prayed it wouldn't be needed. Every time Ember tensed with a contraction, Dr. Moreno found herself holding her breath. "Come on, girl," she whispered to the screen. "You can do this on your own." The morning air grew thick with tension as Ember's labor intensified. Her growls became more frequent, her powerful body working through each contraction. Daniel remained perfectly still, his presence a constant comfort as he continued his gentle humming. The forest settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional bird call and Ember's soft vocalizations. She let out a particularly deep growl, her body tensing visibly. "You've got this, Ember," Daniel whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears of hope. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the rescue center like a soft blanket. Daniel held his breath as Ember's low, guttural cry pierced the quiet morning air. His heart pounded against his ribs as he watched from his carefully chosen spot, far enough not to disturb, but close enough to witness the miracle unfolding before him. With one final push, Ember delivered her first kitten, a tiny wet bundle that immediately began to squirm. Daniel pressed his hand to his mouth, stifling the emotional gasp that threatened to escape. Tears welled in his eyes as he watched Ember's maternal instincts take over. She turned to her newborn, her rough tongue gently cleaning the small form with careful, deliberate strokes. "We did it," Mateo whispered from behind the enclosure, his voice trembling with emotion. "We actually gave her exactly what she needed." Daniel turned to find his young intern wiping tears from his cheeks. He placed a steady hand on Mateo's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. Neither man could find more words as they watched Ember tend to her kitten. Naomi approached silently, her binoculars already trained on the scene. A soft smile played across her usually serious face as she observed the newborn. The morning air felt charged with joy and relief as the three of them stood together, witnesses to this precious moment. Through the clinic window, Dr. Moreno stood motionless, tears streaming freely down her face. Her medical instincts had screamed for intervention, but watching Ember now, confident and caring with her newborn, confirmed that patience had been the right choice. The weight of doubt lifted from her shoulders as she observed the natural process she'd fought so hard to protect. The first rays of sunlight began to break through the trees, casting a warm golden glow over Ember's enclosure. The new mother nuzzled her tiny kitten gently, drawing it closer to her warm body. The small creature, now clean and dry, nestled against its mother's fur. In that peaceful moment, Ember's usual wariness seemed to fade, replaced by a serene focus on her newborn. The tiny kitten, secure in its mother's care, represented everything the team had worked toward, a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of patience and trust. The morning sun cast gentle shadows across Ember's enclosure as she continued her labor. Another tiny form emerged, and like clockwork, Ember's maternal instincts took over. She cleaned her second kitten with the same tender care she'd shown the first, her rough tongue washing away the birth fluids until the little one's fur began to fluff. Daniel watched in amazement as a third kitten arrived within the hour. His chest felt tight with emotion as each new life joined the growing family. Ember gathered her babies close, creating a warm nest of fur and love. "It's incredible," Mateo whispered, his voice thick with wonder. "Look how natural she is with them." The fourth kitten's arrival brought happy tears to everyone's eyes. Ember showed no signs of distress, moving with practiced grace as she cleaned and positioned each of her offspring. The tiny mewling sounds of the kittens filled the enclosure, a symphony of new life that touched everyone's hearts. Naomi burst through the tree line, slightly out of breath from her patrol. Her face broke into a relieved smile as she approached Daniel and Mateo. "The poachers are gone," she announced, her shoulders finally relaxing. "I've checked every inch of the perimeter. She's safe now." Mateo nodded without taking his eyes off the scene before them. "Look at that little one," he said softly, pointing to the smallest kitten snuggling against its mother's belly. In the clinic office, Dr. Moreno sat at her desk, carefully documenting every detail of the births. Her pen moved swiftly across the page as she recorded times, observations, and vital signs. But unlike her usual clinical notes, these were punctuated with small, satisfied smiles. She paused in her writing, looking up at the monitor showing Ember and her kittens. The sight made her reflect on the past few days, how her initial impulse to intervene had given way to a deeper understanding of natural processes. Sometimes, she realized, the best medicine was patience and trust. Ember curled protectively around her newborns, her eyes half closed in contentment. The morning light filtered through the enclosure, creating a peaceful tableau of mother and babies. The entire team stood together at a respectful distance, their faces glowing with shared joy and relief. Daniel exchanged knowing looks with his colleagues, Dr. Moreno's satisfied nod, Naomi's quiet smile, and Mateo's beaming face. In this moment, they were more than just co-workers. They were united in their triumph, having helped bring new life into the world through their patience, dedication, and trust in nature's wisdom. The morning sunlight streamed through the trees, casting dappled patterns across Ember's enclosure. She lay curled in a protective circle around her newborn kittens, their tiny bodies nestled against her warm fur. For the first time since her arrival at the center, her muscles were relaxed, her eyes half closed in contentment. Daniel stood at his usual observation spot, barely daring to breathe. A soft rhythmic rumbling sound reached his ears. "She's purring," he whispered in amazement, his voice thick with emotion. Mateo's face broke into a wide grin. "I've never heard her make that sound before," he said quietly, watching the usually tense bobcat shower her kittens with gentle affection. In the back office, Naomi gripped her phone tightly as she spoke with the local wildlife authorities. "Yes, we've had multiple sightings," she explained, her voice firm. "These poachers need to be stopped before they get bold again." After discussing patrol schedules and security measures, she arranged for temporary reinforcements along the center's perimeter. Hanging up the phone, Naomi allowed herself a small smile. The additional security would ensure Ember and her kittens could grow up safely, without threat of human interference. Later, in the cafeteria, Mateo sat across from Daniel, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. Watching Ember, seeing her heal and trust us enough to have her babies here." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I want to do more. Help animals like Ember on a bigger scale." Daniel looked at his young protege with pride. "You've got good instincts, Mateo. The way you helped create that calming environment for Ember showed real understanding." "You really think I could become a wildlife rehabilitator?" Mateo asked, hope evident in his voice. "I'd be happy to help you learn," Daniel replied, remembering his own journey. "You've already got the most important quality. You care deeply about these animals." Back at the enclosure, Ember gently nudged her kittens toward her belly, guiding them to nurse. Daniel and Mateo watched from their observation point, sharing a proud smile as they witnessed the peaceful scene. The tiny kittens, still blind and helpless, squirmed closer to their mother, while Ember's continuous purring filled the air with contentment. The afternoon sun warmed the clinic windows as Dr. Moreno stood quietly, clipboard in hand. Through her binoculars, she watched Ember and her kittens in their den. The mother bobcat was grooming each tiny form with gentle strokes of her tongue, while the kittens squirmed and nursed contentedly. "Perfect weight distribution," Dr. Moreno murmured, making notes. "Good coloring, strong movements." Her usual serious expression softened into a smile. "You're doing great, Ember." In the rescue center's gardens, surrounded by native wildflowers, Daniel and Naomi walked slowly, deep in discussion. "There's a protected area deeper in the forest," Naomi explained, gesturing toward the tree line. "It's far enough from human activity, but still within our monitoring range. The enclosure there is 3 times larger than her current one, with natural features: fallen logs, rocky outcrops." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "She needs that transition, a chance to teach her kittens in a more natural setting." "Exactly," Naomi agreed. "They need to learn hunting behaviors, and that space has a controlled prey population we can maintain." Meanwhile, in the dusty storage shed, Mateo rifled through old boxes, pausing when he found a stack of faded wildlife brochures. His eyes lit up as he flipped through them, taking in the information about local bobcat populations. "Daniel!" he called out, rushing to find his mentor. When he caught up to Daniel and Naomi in the gardens, his words tumbled out excitedly. "What if we hosted an event? Teach people about bobcats, why they're important, what happens when we destroy their habitat." Daniel's face brightened. "That's brilliant, Mateo. Education is our best defense against poaching." "We could invite schools," Mateo continued, gaining confidence. "Show them how amazing these animals are, like Ember." As evening approached, the 3 of them gathered near Ember's enclosure. The setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, while inside, Ember nursed her kittens peacefully. The sight filled them with quiet joy and determination. "This is just the beginning," Naomi said, her voice firm with resolve. 1 week later, the morning mist still clung to the forest floor as Daniel and the team prepared for Ember's big move. The new enclosure stretched before them, a natural haven filled with towering pines and thick undergrowth. Native plants swayed in the gentle breeze, while fallen logs and climbing branches created perfect hiding spots and play areas. Daniel watched as Mateo carefully opened the transport cage. Ember emerged slowly, her whiskers twitching as she took in the new scents. Her kittens huddled close behind her, their tiny paws stepping uncertainly on the forest floor. "Easy now," Daniel whispered, though they were safely hidden in the observation blind. Ember's ears swiveled, taking in the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling. She padded forward, her movements becoming more confident with each step. The kittens, emboldened by their mother's calm, began to explore. "Look at that little one," Mateo whispered, pointing to the smallest kitten who had discovered a floating leaf. The tiny bobcat pounced, tumbling over its own feet in excitement. Its siblings quickly joined the game, batting at leaves and chasing each other around a fallen log. Dr. Moreno smiled, her clipboard forgotten in her hands. "This is what we worked for," she said softly. "They're acting just like wild bobcats should." As evening approached, the team gathered around the center's fire pit. The flames cast dancing shadows as they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey they'd shared. Dr. Moreno cleared her throat. "Daniel," she said, meeting his eyes across the fire, "I need to thank you. You showed me that sometimes the best medicine is patience and trust in nature." Naomi nodded in agreement. "We all learned from each other," she added, glancing around the circle. "It took every one of us working together to give Ember this chance." Mateo sat quietly, absorbing the moment. His eyes reflected the flickering flames as he watched his mentors, clearly inspired by everything he'd witnessed and learned. The fire crackled softly as they sat together, the success of their efforts warming them more than the flames. Daniel gazed into the fire, his expression peaceful. Above them, the forest came alive with the gentle sounds of the evening, a perfect backdrop to their quiet celebration. The morning sun filtered through the white canvas of the community event tent as Daniel adjusted the microphone. Rows of folding chairs filled with local residents faced the makeshift stage where a large screen displayed photos of Ember and her kittens. Mateo stood nearby, nervously shuffling his note cards. "This is Ember," Daniel began, his voice warm and steady. "Just a few weeks ago, she was a frightened mother-to-be who didn't trust anyone." The screen showed an image of Ember pacing in her old enclosure, her eyes wild with fear. Mateo stepped forward, gaining confidence as he spoke. "We learned that sometimes the best way to help is to step back and listen." His words drew knowing nods from the audience. "Ember taught us that every animal has their own journey to healing." As they shared the story of the midnight watches, the careful preparations, and the ultimate triumph of Ember's successful delivery, several audience members dabbed at their eyes. One elderly woman clutched her chest when they showed pictures of the newborn kittens nestled against their mother. Meanwhile, in her patrol truck, Naomi received a crackling radio call. Her face broke into a relieved smile as she heard the news. The poacher ring had been caught trying to trap animals in a neighboring county. Justice had finally caught up with them. On the clinic balcony, Dr. Moreno leaned against the railing, her usual professional demeanor softening as she spoke to Daniel. "I was so certain we needed to intervene," she confessed, her voice catching. "The thought of losing her, or the kittens. I almost forced that surgery." Daniel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You made the right choice when it mattered most," he assured her. "That's what saved them." Back at the event, people gathered around the display boards, studying the photos and reading about wildlife conservation. As Daniel and Mateo began packing up their materials, a small girl in a yellow dress approached them timidly. "How can I help animals like Ember?" she asked, her eyes bright with determination. Daniel knelt down to her level, smiling warmly. "It starts with caring," he said, glancing at the nearby photo of Ember contentedly grooming her kittens. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Daniel and Naomi crouched behind the observation blind. Inside the forest enclosure, Ember moved with purpose, her tail held high as she guided her kittens toward a fallen log with low-hanging branches. "Watch this," Naomi whispered, pointing as Ember demonstrated climbing techniques with graceful leaps. The smallest kitten mewed in frustration, batting at the rough bark with tiny paws. Its sibling showed more interest in a leaf dancing in the breeze, pouncing with unsteady determination. Ember waited patiently, her amber eyes fixed on her little ones. Back at the center, Mateo sorted through boxes of pamphlets and educational materials in the storage shed. His hand stilled as he discovered a glossy brochure buried beneath wildlife fact sheets. Wildlife Rehabilitation Certification Program, the title read, with a scholarship application tucked inside. His heart raced as he read the requirements. "Everything okay in here?" Daniel's voice made Mateo jump. "I found this," Mateo said, holding out the application with slightly trembling hands. "But I don't know if I'm qualified enough." Daniel took the paper, scanning it quickly. A warm smile spread across his face. "You've shown more dedication and heart these past weeks than some people do in years. You should absolutely apply." In her clinic office, Dr. Moreno typed detailed notes into Ember's file. "Patient demonstrates excellent maternal instincts. Kittens developing normally, showing natural hunting behaviors." She paused her typing to print a recent photo of Ember and her family. The image showed the bobcat attentively grooming one of her kittens, their bond evident in every gentle touch. Dr. Moreno pinned the photo to her corkboard, right next to her veterinary license. It would serve as a daily reminder that sometimes the best medicine was patience and trust. Back at the enclosure, a collective gasp of delight escaped Daniel and Naomi as they watched the smallest kitten finally grasp the climbing technique. Its tiny claws found purchase in the bark, and with determined scrambling, it reached the low branch. The other kittens followed, their movements becoming more confident with each attempt. "They're going to be just fine," Naomi said softly, her eyes bright with pride. Daniel nodded, watching as Ember supervised her kitten's newfound skill with quiet vigilance. The forest around them hummed with life, embracing the small family in its peaceful shelter. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees as Naomi walked the forest perimeter, her boots crunching softly on fallen leaves. She paused occasionally to make notes on her tablet, marking areas where the dense undergrowth and natural shelters could support a growing wildlife population. "This section here," she explained to Daniel, pointing to a secluded valley, "it's perfect for lynx breeding grounds, similar elevation and coverage to where they naturally thrive." Daniel nodded, seeing the potential in the landscape. "How many breeding pairs could we support?" "With proper expansion of the protected area?" Naomi's eyes lit up. "At least 3, maybe 4. I've already reached out to the Mountain Ridge Center up north. They're interested in collaborating on a regional conservation program." Inside the rescue center's lobby, Mateo sat across from Sarah Chen, a journalist from the Regional Wildlife Chronicle. His hands fidgeted slightly as she set up her recorder. "So tell me," Sarah began warmly, "how did Ember's story change your perspective on wildlife rehabilitation?" Mateo hesitated, then found his voice. "At first, I thought it was just about medical care and feeding schedules," he admitted. "But Ember taught me it's so much more. It's about trust, patience, and understanding each animal's unique needs." The journalist leaned forward, captivated. "And now you're pursuing wildlife rehabilitation as a career?" "Yes," Mateo smiled, his confidence growing. "Ember's story showed me what's possible when we give animals the chance to heal on their own terms." As the day drew to a close, Daniel stood at his usual spot near the enclosure. The setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, casting a gentle glow over the scene before him. Ember lounged on a flat rock, her tail twitching contentedly as she watched her kittens chase each other through the tall grass. One kitten pounced on a butterfly, missing completely and tumbling into its sibling. Their mother's eyes remained half closed, showing none of the anxiety that had marked their early days together. The peace of the moment wrapped around Daniel like a warm blanket, filling him with quiet satisfaction. The kittens eventually tired themselves out, stumbling back to collapse against their mother's soft fur. Ember stretched lazily, welcoming them with a gentle purr that carried clearly in the evening air. Daniel watched as the small family settled in for the night, their contentment a powerful testament to the center's mission. The community center buzzed with excitement as people filed into rows of folding chairs. Strings of twinkling lights hung overhead, casting a warm glow across the makeshift stage. Daniel fidgeted with his tie, while Mateo smoothed his shirt for the 10th time. "I can't believe this many people came," Mateo whispered, scanning the crowd. The center's director stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. "Tonight, we honor 4 incredible individuals who showed us the true meaning of dedication and compassion." As each team member accepted their award, they shared brief but heartfelt words. Dr. Moreno spoke about learning to trust natural processes. Naomi emphasized the importance of patience and observation. Mateo, his voice trembling slightly, thanked Daniel for being his mentor. When it was Daniel's turn, he gripped the podium, taking a deep breath. "Sometimes our greatest teachers are the animals we're trying to help. Ember taught us about trust, patience, and the healing power of giving someone space to find their way." Later that evening, Daniel and Naomi stood at the forest lookout, watching deer graze in the clearing below. The sight reminded them both of that pivotal moment weeks ago. "Remember that doe and her fawn?" Naomi asked softly. "Who knew such a simple moment would guide us to the right path with Ember?" Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on the peaceful scene below. "We were trying too hard at first. Nature showed us the way." "You never gave up, though," Naomi said, turning to face him, "even when things looked impossible." "It wasn't just me," Daniel replied. "We all brought something essential to the table. Your experience, Dr. Moreno's knowledge, Mateo's enthusiasm." Back in his room, Daniel carefully pinned the new photo of Ember and her kittens to his wall. Next to it hung the old photograph of himself with the hawk, a reminder of a painful loss that had haunted him for years. Looking at both images, tears welled in his eyes. But this time they weren't bitter. The contrast between the two photos told a story of growth, learning, and redemption. His fingers traced the edge of the hawk's photo, then moved to touch the image of Ember with her thriving kittens. For the first time, he felt the weight of his past failure lift from his shoulders. The success with Ember hadn't erased the past, but it had helped heal an old wound. Sitting on his bed, Daniel smiled through his tears, finally at peace with both the victories and losses that had shaped his journey. The morning dew sparkled on leaves and grass as Daniel, Mateo, Naomi, and Dr. Moreno gathered at the forest enclosure. Through the early mist, they watched Ember guide her kittens toward unexplored territory. Her movements were confident, her steps sure as she led her family deeper into the thicket. One kitten pounced on a butterfly, while another batted at low-hanging leaves. Their mother paused, waiting patiently for them to catch up. At the edge of the dense brush, Ember turned her head, her amber eyes meeting Daniel's for a brief moment. The look seemed to carry a message of gratitude before she continued forward. From their position in the observation blind, the team watched in reverent silence. Daniel felt Mateo trembling slightly beside him and placed a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. Naomi's usual stern expression softened into an approving smile. Dr. Moreno dabbed at her eyes with her sleeve, professional composure giving way to pride. "She's ready," Naomi whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning bird songs. The kittens tumbled after their mother, their movements growing more coordinated with each passing day. Their spotted coats blended perfectly with the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. At the center's gate, the team began their walk back. Morning sunbeams broke through the trees, creating golden paths across the forest floor. The air was filled with chirping birds and rustling leaves, nature's own celebration of life. "I never thought we'd get here," Mateo said softly, looking back one last time. Daniel nodded, understanding exactly what his young protege meant. Each of them had played a crucial role in this journey. Dr. Moreno's medical expertise, Naomi's wildlife wisdom, Mateo's unwavering enthusiasm, and Daniel's patient leadership. They walked in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the remarkable journey they'd shared. The forest seemed to embrace them, its morning symphony a perfect backdrop to this moment of quiet triumph. Through the trees, they caught one final glimpse of Ember leading her kittens into a sunny clearing before disappearing into the thicket. Their laughing chatter mixed with the natural sounds of the forest as they made their way back to the center, ready for whatever new challenges awaited them. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.